Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and for today's video I am using one of the brand new stamp sets that was just released at Honeybee Stamps. I will have info and links on my blog because this is part of a massive blog hop to celebrate this release. So I decided to finally break into my pack of Arches cold press watercolor paper. I don't even want to admit how long I've owned this, and I've been hoarding it and petting it. It's nice. It's not cheap watercolor paper, that's for sure, but there's a reason because it's such good quality. So I pulled out a sheet and I cut it down to 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches, and I'm scoring it at 4 1/4. And I had to score it multiple times. This is very heavyweight watercolor paper. Like the fibers in it, it's very dense, and the texture on it it's hard to explain. The more I've been playing with watercolor paper, yeah, texture is a big deal. Usually we like to go for smooth cardstock when it comes to stamping cards and that sort of thing. But when it comes to watercolor paper, the texture can really make a difference. And I know that Arches has a beautiful, just a really nice, fine texture to it. So I wanted to create a 1-layer card and do some watercoloring with one of the new sets from Honeybee. So I chose the new Mermaid Song stamp set. I really liked this large image because I was like, this could take center stage on my card. So I lined up my watercolor paper in my Misti and then decided where I was going to stamp my image. And I'm inking up the image with Versafine Onyx black ink. This is one of my favorite inks for watercoloring with because it is a waterproof ink, and it stamps detail really, really well. I purposely used my Misti though because, again, I'm stamping on a watercolor texture paper. I've noticed the Arches, it actually takes the stamp really well, but the Misti helped. I did need to stamp it twice because this image has a lot of detail, you know, in the hair and the little scales on her tail and that sort of thing. So I found stamping it twice was perfect. And when I use Versafine, I like to try and clean it off my stamps immediately, mostly just because it has a different sort of residue to it. So it's like if I clean it immediately, then I'm good to go. So cleaned off that stamp, and then I flipped over this watercolor paper. So I'm now stamping on the inside of the card, which this side of the watercolor paper is smoother. So a person, if you don't want to use the textured side, you could just stamp on the smooth side. But because this is a 1-layer card, there's going to be one side or the other. So I'm stamping on the inside now, and I just lined up the sentiment I wanted to use from this set, and then a few of the little like shell images. Lined those all up, stamped it with the same ink. Then I can clean off my stamps and put them back into the set, and now I can go on to watercoloring. So not too long ago, I got my hands on the Daniel Smith dot charts. These are watercolors, and you can get different packs, you know, that they've done like different collaborations with. I have the full pack of like 200 and some Daniel Smith colors on just these 4 sheets of watercolor paper, and they're all labeled and everything, and I love it. Love it. It's a way to satisfy my inner need to have full sets of everything without having to spend the hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to get every single color. So I've got all these little dots I can play with. And another thing I love about these is it kind of forces me to have a little bit of a lighter hand. I've mentioned this in other videos. I tend to have a really heavy hand when it comes to coloring and watercoloring and that sort of thing. It's very difficult for me to lighten up. I usually use too much color, too much water, etc., etc. But having these little dots, it just forces me to think a little smaller and to, you know, not mess around as much. And I'm using, you know, a smaller brush, etc. And I really like that. So all I'm doing is I'm just using a water brush and just touching the water brush to these little dots of watercolor, and then just bringing color to the watercolor paper and filling it in. I'm not doing anything overly fancy, you know, any sort of watercolor techniques or any, you know, washes or anything like that. It's literally just simple coloring. I'm not even getting, you know, the cardstock wet or the watercolor paper wet ahead of time. You can do that, you know, and then the color really moves, especially these Daniel Smith ones. But I found that with this watercolor paper and these colors, the color just moved easily. I didn't have to worry about, you know, getting any harsh lines or anything like that. And as I'm just going along, I have super sped this up. This is about 800 times faster than I actually did it. It took me probably a good 20 minutes, maybe half an hour to watercolor this. I just kind of took my time and had fun, you know, playing with some of the different colors. Daniel Smith has some like shimmery watercolors too, which are really fun. So it's hard to see on camera, but like the end of her tail and some of her hair and a little bit of that shell, I used a little bit of the shimmer watercolors just to add that little extra something. And then once I was done all the main image, I'm going to go on and start doing like this actual scene here. So just picking up the color with my water brush and applying it. So I colored the rocks, and then I'm going to do the water, and then I'm going to do the sand, and just kind of having fun. And I also did not tape this down. This was another reason I'm not using tons of water, because this isn't taped down, because I'm going, I'm watercoloring right up to the edge. So I didn't want to tape this down and have a border on it. Plus I wanted to see just how this watercolor paper kind of works. And because I'm not using a lot of water, it's not warping much at all. So yeah, I was having fun with it. I really, really enjoyed using these watercolors. This image is absolutely adorable. If you hop along the blog hop, you will see tons of other creations that the rest of the team made. There's so many, this whole theme is, under the ocean, and so many ocean and mermaid themed stuff. It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So for my background, I'm just picking up one of the blues, and I'm just kind of dabbing the color on and then softening it out a little bit. I was kind of thinking cloudy sky. That saved me from having to do a large wash on the background, do the whole thing in blue, using too much water, and it would take way too long. So doing it in that way kind of gave the illusion of clouds, plus it took less time and used less water. So let that kind of dry, and then I went on to the inside and did the exact same thing to the little shells, just filled them with color. Then I made sure everything was completely dry before I put this back into my Misti. I want to stamp one of the large stamps from this Mermaid song set. I did originally think about stamping it in black when I stamped the main image, but I thought how pretty this would look if I stamped the sentiment and embossed it. So I lined this up in my Misti, and then I'm using my anti-static powder tool, and I'm trying to be liberal with the powder tool because, again, this is textured watercolor paper. I did my watercoloring. I do not want this sentiment to mess up anything. So I lined it up. I used my anti-static powder tool, and then I inked up the stamp and stamped it twice with VersaMark ink because I wanted to make sure I got it perfectly stamped. So I stamped it with the VersaMark ink, which is a clear, sticky, slow-drying ink. And then I'm using some Nuvo embossing powder. This is the gold Enchantment embossing powder. So it's gold, and it's got a little bit of gold glitter in it. Not a ton, but just a bit. So like as it catches the light, there's like little glints of glitter, which I thought was perfect for this image. So I stamped that, tapped off the excess, and then, a little bit here and there stuck into the little grooves of the texture of the watercolor paper, but I just brushed those away before I melted this with my heat tool. And then I've got my sentiment stamped, and then I could not resist adding just a little bit more sparkle. So I pulled out my diamond Stickles, and again, it's hard to show on camera, but I am barely squeezing this bottle, and I'm just very lightly dabbing it. I don't want a thick, goopy layer of this, because one, I don't want it to obscure all the coloring details. Two, I don't want it to reactivate the watercolor and, cause it to smear and make a mess. And three, I want it to dry quicker. So doing really, really thin, tiny little dabs gets that glitter on there without it being like a big old blob. So I just went along and started adding it, added it to her tail, and then I started adding to her hair, and then her little shirt and the shell, and then decided to add some to the water in the background and dot it onto the rocks because I never know when to stop. But still kept it fairly simple. So that's it. That finished off this card. As always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I will have a link to the supplies used. I will have links to all the other hoppers. Make sure you check that out. There's a time-sensitive giveaway going on as well if you're watching this around the time this is published. Honeybee is giving away some gift certificates to their store to celebrate this big release. So that info will be in my blog post, which will be linked directly below the video. So check that out below if you're interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping my videos. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.